Good evening. I'm Jane Simone. I'm the Associate Chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Washington, and I have the distinct honor of welcoming you all tonight to the 215 Annual Edwards Public Lecture Series. I'm pleased you could join the Psychology Department as we celebrate one of our research specialties, and that is the psychological science of inequity and inequality. Before introducing these evening's lectures, let me just make a few comments about how this series came about. This annual lecture series is a result of the generosity of Professor Alan L. Edwards, who made a substantial gift to establish an endowment that ensures the series can take place free of charge to everyone in perpetuity. Professor Edwards was affiliated with our department for half a century, from his arrival in 1944 until his death in 1994. He was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer. He is credited with changing the way modern psychological research is carried out by introducing statistical techniques that we still use today in the field. His statistics books were long-standing gold standards for all of psychology research. The Edwards family contribution to the psychology department is an example of what can be accomplished with the support from members of the community, such as each of you in the room. Especially in these tough economic times, your support is critical and very much appreciated. I thank and applaud many of you who have already made significant contributions to our department. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our next speaker tonight is Professor Kathryn Whetten, who hails from Duke University, where she's been for the last 21 years. She's Professor of Public Policy and Global Health, with additional appointments in Community and Family Medicine and Nursing. She received her undergraduate education at Bates College in Maine, and she received a PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in Population Health. Currently, she's the director of the Center for Health Policy and Inequalities Research, which is part of the Duke Global Health Institute. Professor Whetten has been the lead investigator for over 20 research studies. She's the author of 4 books and over 80 peer-reviewed articles. Professor Whetten and her intervention, service, and research teams have research projects addressing various topics, including the care and well-being of orphaned and separated children, HIV/AIDS, mental health, substance use, and poverty. They work all over the world, including the US Deep South, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Malawi, India, Cambodia, and Russia. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you tonight Professor Kathryn Whetten.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight. And I'm going to be talking with you tonight about some of the work that I've been doing with wonderful colleagues that I have, including Dr. Dorsey, who's here, with orphan and abandoned children around the world. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about children at risk generally, both here in the United States and internationally. In the work that I do, we always work with local non-governmental organizations. And these organizations are on the ground, working all the time, running the studies, and deserve much of the credit for the kind of work that we do. As I start this talk, you would think we would know what an orphan is, but we have different definitions of orphans, and it makes a difference when you're looking at the literature, how you define them. So we could say an orphan is a child who has 2 parents who have died. And that's often what we assume people are talking about when they talk about orphaned children. But you can also be called an orphan, if you have 1 parent who died. And that's actually the definition that's used in most of the international policy documents. So when you see figures like we have 153 million orphans cited by UNICEF or USAID, they are actually talking about having 1 or 2 parents who have died. And so this is important in the kind of work that we do. You can also be orphaned, and we commonly recognize the term when a child is abandoned. So when we think of children who are in orphanages, many, if not most of them, have a living parent somewhere, and yet we consider them to be orphans also. So we're talking about children at risk, children living in adversity, orphaned or separated children, orphaned or abandoned children. And if we want to look at how the kids are doing, we want to look at where they are. So what I am really interested in is trying to figure out how to improve care and well-being and the well-being of children, and doing it in ways that are feasible in local communities, whether that's in northeast central Durham, North Carolina, where I am, or whether it is in Moshi, Tanzania. And so we want to look at where children are, how they're living, who's doing well, who's not doing well, and try to understand why. So the children are living, some are living with a parent, living with a grandparent or other relative. They're in a family setting, could be with a non-relative, they could be adopted. They could be on the streets, and we have rising numbers of children on the streets around the world these days. And that's important as we think about some of the issues that I'm going to raise in the talk today. We also have children who are in group homes. We may call those group homes institutions, orphanages, institutions. And we have group homes here in the United States also. We have residential education programs here in the United States that are our former orphanages. Most of the kids are being cared for in the poorest communities, whether it's here in the US, so most of the kids at risk and orphan children are being cared for in the poorest communities who have the least resources and within the families and homes. So as we go about trying to understand the needs that the children have, we can start by looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've got the physiological safety. We want them to have water, nutrition. We want them to be safe from harm. And then we want them to be loved and cared for, have high self-esteem. So as we've looked at other studies that have been done in different countries around the world, we found that the work was really limited. And actually, it was a master's student who I was working with who first brought this issue really to my attention. I was doing a lot with HIV/AIDS and substance abuse, and she was working with someone and wanted to understand what the best care practices are for kids who are orphaned around the world. So she would go and bring in literature, and as we started looking at it, it was reports. It was just cross-sectional studies saying there are X number of orphans in the world, they're at high risk for all sorts of terrible things, but no one was really following them, no one was looking at care options. And then you had some studies that focused that were in particular countries, like we have some excellent data and research coming out of Romania. There's looking at infants who were in institutions with severe emotional and social neglect, deprived places, and the effect that can have on the brain, and what can be recovered when they're put into excellent foster care. We have studies coming out of Uganda and South Africa, but as you look at these, and as we think about making policies with these studies, you can imagine that culture plays a big part. So it could be, many would say that in Uganda, that communities take care of all of the children who are orphaned or in trouble. So if my neighbor dies, I would take care of the children who are there. And that may or may not be the case, as we've learned. But it may not apply to another country, such as in India or Cambodia, or a culture where there is a belief that you don't have to take care of your neighbor's children. In the United States, oftentimes, or my brother's children, or where you may even say, well, you know, this child, it's okay that they're suffering because in the next life, they'll be doing better. And so it's okay that we treat them as a slave now and have them work, and they're lucky to have us at all. So we'll keep them home, and they'll clean and wash and things for us. So you can imagine that culture really makes a difference, and yet the policies that we're creating cross countries and are pushed the strongest, or we have the most power in those countries that are the poorest, where we provide the most aid. So there was also studies that were being done that were starting to compare, as the ones I talked about in Romania, kind of kids who were living in group homes, in institutions, and children in families. But they were very limited also, in that they would have 1 or 2 institutions and 50, 75 families. They're all pretty small, mostly pretty small studies. But you can't really tell how children do generally in group homes if you're only looking at a couple of them, because your outcomes are going to be based on the unique characteristics of that environment that they're in, that institution in this case. So we decided to start another study and work in different countries around the world. And this has expanded over time. These are some of the places where we were listed earlier. And I put this slide up here. This is work that we're now doing, and I put it up here to show how one can move from what we'd call kind of research where we're following people. So we have a population cohort. We're following them over time. We're following kids over time and their caregivers. And that can then lead to identifying problems and interventions that we can then go in and test and evaluate. So we start with the positive outcomes for orphans. I'll call it the POFO study. We're now in year 9 of that study. We've been following kids for 8 years. We then will talk later tonight about the traumatic grief cognitive behavioral therapy work that we're doing in Tanzania and Kenya. In El Salvador, the government has committed to improving child care centers, all of the child care centers throughout the country, and have a pretty neat model. And the government is hiring the monitors, so it's a sustainable model over time. They're the ones who are being trained to implement the intervention, and we're doing the evaluation for that. We're also working in Ethiopia. There are places, a number of countries where they're starting to shut down group homes, the institutions. So we're trying to follow those kids out of care and see what happens to them. We've been working with collaborators in Russia to look at the kind of care that children are receiving there and what we might actually be able to learn. That work is rather difficult today with the current climate. We've been working in Malawi, where they also decided that some people from Uganda and from Malawi said, you know, we think that we have enough resources to take care of the kids, but none of us know about each other, and we don't know how to integrate care. And so you've got all these NGOs and government and governmental Malawian services out there, but they're not coordinated. So let's go to different regions, pull those people together, those organizations together, and see if we can actually improve care for orphans and the outcomes for orphan and vulnerable children. And in Cambodia, likewise, you have pagodas, you have monks who have been taking care of children for thousands of years and are seen as being very central to communities in Cambodia. And what's often done with NGOs is they go in and they set up their own system and start delivering services, whether it's food or uniforms, school uniforms, or they work with churches. So in this case, an organization decided to work with the monks and have them delivering the services, them identifying the families that were caring for children who were orphaned and abandoned. And the monks would go to the houses and deliver food, and they had times when the families could come in each month to the pagoda and have activities for the family, and it was seen as a real self-esteem builder, and it was building on a system that was already there rather than trying to put in a new system. So sustainability is going to be really important in the kinds of work that we do. How do we do things where it's not foreigners coming in and setting up a new system and telling people what to do? So for our study, we tried to, the positive outcomes for orphans, we tried to address some of the limitations of previous studies. So we chose 6 sites that were as culturally diverse as we could afford, culturally, politically, historically diverse. And at each of those sites, we chose randomly selected 500 children who were orphaned and abandoned. So for us, you can be orphaned, you can be a single orphan, a double orphan, or abandoned, meaning your parents have left you and there's no expectation that they will return and we don't know where they are. For our study, that's held up pretty well. I know that it's a term that can be problematic for people who are providing services because people can claim that the parents are gone, but they really aren't gone. But here it's a research study. There's no reason to want to be in the study except that you see some benefit to others down the line. We started, the children were ages 6 to 12 in the beginning, and as I said, we're now in year 8 of following the children. Each area where we were working, and I'll show you a map of where this study is, each area where we were working, we broke the region down into kind of zip codes, clusters, randomly selected 50 of them, went to that area, identified through door-to-door knocking all of the children who were orphaned and abandoned in that area, randomly selected 5 children. We also spent about 6 months in each site identifying the different group homes that were there. And I didn't know when we went into this how important the group home issue was going to become. I didn't know that there was going to be a policy debate already starting about group homes and whether children should be in them at all. But one of the things that we learned that I was surprised at right in the beginning is that there were many more group homes than any one person knew about. So at each site, we started by going to local officials. And for example, in Moshi, they knew of 3 group homes at the time that we started. And the group homes they knew of were foreign-run, or in other sites, government-run. But then you start talking to the school teachers, you talk to principals, you talk to people who are caring for kids, and everyone is identifying another place. So all of a sudden, in Moshi, we had 33 group homes. So one of the first lessons that we learned is that most of the group homes are actually not foreign-run, they're not government-run, they've grown up out of the community. They tended to be places where there was a pastor or church group, one place where 12 kids were brought to a pastor and his wife. They went to their church, which is not foreign funded, said, we need to take care of these kids. We have a building over here. Can we use this building? There are some women who don't have biological children of their own. Can they come and live there? And the place grows and is supported by the community. And the children are part of the community. They go to school. They're out on the streets with the other kids. So very different from what we might imagine an institution looking like. And I'll show some images of what we might think of in our stereotypes in a moment. So we ended up with 3,000 orphaned and abandoned children across the 6 sites. And we also have a non-orphan sample from each site. So these are our sites. We are in Cambodia. We're in India, in a place called Nagaland, which is one of the most beautiful places I've been. Hyderabad, we're in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Originally, we had Brazil was going to be in the study, and we had some other countries that ended up not moving forward with us, in part because our funding was cut, and we had to select some sites that could move forward quickly. Importantly, so I told you that our study, we started age 6 and up, and it's important to know that 95% of the kids out there who are orphaned and abandoned and in need of places to stay and support are over the age of 5. So we really need to be looking at this group of children as well as infants. But the over 5s are really important. We've been going out and talking to the children every 6 months for the first 5 years and then every year. And we're looking at their life history. So we're looking at how many times they've moved from one place to another, who they're living with, are there siblings there or not, what is their social support network, who do they know, what's the education of the people in their support network, what kind of jobs do they have. And we look at their outcomes, emotional, cognitive, health status, education. As the kids are getting older, we're looking at income, what kind of jobs they're taking. We're looking at civic engagement. Do they help out in the community? Do they feel that they're part of the community? Who is their community? Family formation, we're starting to look at reproductive health. We do have kids who are being taken away and put into kind of sex work and going to the Thai border, and so we're trying to track these kids and bring them back and understand what it is that has helped some kids be resilient and some kids who have ended up in situations that are not as good. And of course, we're looking at the placement characteristics and risk factors. So as we got into this, we also realized that there was no definition of what an institution group home is, and people were using all sorts of different terms for it. And it was very confusing, again, because policies were being written that are uniform across what is called institutions usually in the language, where we're saying that we need to shut down institutions. But we can also call them residential education programs like we have here in the US that happen to have kids from 0 to 18 who happen to live there year-round. And half of them have schools on them, and half of them do not. They're going to school in their communities here in the US. We can call them youth villages, group homes. So for us, we realized that we needed to have our own definition. So the definition was that you had to have at least 5 children who are not biologically related to the caregiver and not biologically related to each other. And we don't have most of the average size of our group homes was 25. So also, there are a lot of small places out there, again, that policies are being applied to. And so we have images like this for institutions. But then, as we went around, we found that that actually is not what we're seeing in many of the low and middle income countries that we're looking at. And we also started looking at some of the past literature that's shown poor outcomes for the children in the other places. And we found that even in those meta-analyses, even in looking at those studies, that when they were looking at places in low and middle income countries, the outcomes were not as bad. So this is all a kind of a big question. And because this became a central focus, we were pushed into this policy debate. It's something that I'm going to talk a bit more about here tonight also. Again, we have residential education programs here in the US. We don't think about them. We think about treatment places where we put a kid in and we have them fixed, hopefully over a 6-week period, a 3-month period, and then pull it back out. But we actually also have these residential education programs here in the US that really need to be evaluated to see how the kids are doing. What we found when we looked at outcomes, this graph is going to come a bit quickly, and then I'll explain it, but this is emotional difficulties. These are the outcomes for the kids. You can see that we have variation in the emotional difficulties. The top part of this graph are poorer outcomes, and you saw that we had kids who were in what we'll call institutions, just to use the term that's being used in policy, and community. And you can see that the outcomes are almost the same, that there's great variation. We have kids who are doing really poorly, and I've seen the children who are doing really poorly. We have kids who are doing really well, and we have them in both settings. So there's variation, but not by setting. So here comes the cognitive ability. So you've got institution outcomes, how they're doing, and you've got the community, and they overlap. In the first box here, we have the baseline. And we could then argue we have the same problem that other studies have had. It's cross-sectional data, so we don't know what is due to how the kid was doing when they arrived in that place. So it was important with the longitudinal follow-up to see if there was change. And you could argue it, and people have argued it either way. So you could say that kids who show up in group homes and institutions were probably the poorest off, the worst off to begin with. And so they're going to look worse when we get to them and test them. Or you could say, as many do, well, the best kids, the kids who are best off, end up in the group homes because they're going to be adopted, or the family sees this as a way for that child to be saved, and so they take the smartest and the healthiest child and put them into the institution. What this would say is that regardless of when we look at it, and even when we follow the kids over time, we're seeing, again, that the variation is not about that structure. It's not about the box that I'm living in. It's about other things that are happening within that structure. And those things can be positive or negative in either place. So similarly, here we have the outcomes on body mass index. So we're looking at height and weight. We have difficulty score, and we have the general health. We have different measures of health. Here we're just, the same kinds of outcomes. Here we're just looking at, from the child's perspective and from the caregiver, how well do you rate this child's health from very good to very poor. And the solid line here is the kids who are in group homes, who are in the institutions. The dotted line is the kids who are living in family settings. And then the bars are the averages for different group homes. Again, great variation, but not between family and institution. It's variation that's attributable to the kids and their caregivers. So one of the things that we found was that mental health, emotional well-being was really important to the kids and really important to the caregivers. And the caregivers were saying, can't you do something to help us? Because we don't know how to deal with the kids crying, with their fear, with their fighting, with the emotional difficulties that they were expressing. And one of the things that we found was that being orphaned or abandoned was a terrible trauma, and in addition to that, they were experiencing kind of chronic trauma. These are potentially traumatic events that the kids might have experienced. And you can see, other than being orphaned, you can see that the vast majority, 91, 92%, have experienced other kinds of potentially traumatic events that are severe enough to possibly have experiences of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And those events range from witnessing a family death other than the death of that parent. So you're witnessing another family member's death. Physical or sexual abuse, about half of the kids. This is severe physical abuse to the extent that the child feared for their life. Violence in the family that was scary to the child, and the child feared for their life. Forced to leave home other than going into the institution, so you had to run from your home for some reason. War, riots, killings, disasters, and accidents. The first two columns are the prevalence by age 13, and the next are the yearly incidents. This graph is very similar information presented in a different way. One of the things that I think is really important, again from a policy perspective, is that we focus much attention on the need for safety for girls. And what money there is often is targeted towards protecting the girl children, the girls on the streets, the girls who are orphaned and abandoned. What this graph shows us is that boys are as likely to have been sexually abused and have physical abuse and any kind of trauma. But it is true, if we break this down by trauma type, as the girls before the age of 13. Once you go over the age of 13, so once they're over puberty, then the rates for girls continues to rise and the rates for boys drops off. But before puberty, the boys are at as high risk for abuse as the girls are. So we really need to, when we're thinking about the programs that we're going to implement for kids, we really need to, yes, think about protecting the girls, but we also need to protect the boys. And we know from other work that boys who are sexually abused and severely physically abused are more likely later in life to engage in high-risk sexual behaviors, as well as girls too. So you really need to be protecting both. So I feel very strongly about that message and making sure that we're not leaving the boys out. One of the things that was said when we started the study, and this was a while ago now, but when we started the study, what many people said was, well, yeah, the kids may be experiencing trauma, but really anxiety and depression and these psychosocial needs, they don't have time to feel those things. Their lives are very difficult. You know, they got to get up in the morning, they got to get the water, they've got to get to school, whatever it is they're doing, the life is too difficult for them to experience these things. And how are you going to measure them? You certainly can't use our kind of Western, Northern measures. So, and let me just step back for a moment and say that all the questions that we ask are all adapted to the sites where we're working. What we see here is this is the number of traumatic categories reported by the kids, and we look at anxiety and we look at the difficulty scores. And what we see is that as the number of traumas increases, anxiety and difficulties increase. So that may seem very obvious, that's what should happen, but it's actually an important finding to say these are kids who are in need, and what the caregivers are telling us about, gosh, how can you help us? What can we do to try and work with our kids' grief and difficulties and things is very important. Also, for these slides, you have single orphans as being the thicker dotted line, the straight line is the double orphaned. The abandoned kids are also experiencing the difficulties, and the non-orphan and abandoned kids. So go back to the beginning of my talk where I said that these kids are being cared for in the poorest communities. And the kids are often alone most of the day because the parents or caregivers are off trying to earn some money somewhere, trying to bring some food home. And so the other kids in that community are also experiencing these potentially traumatic events too. Unfortunately, our sample size for that is smaller, and so there's less that we can say about those kids, but community-level interventions, I think, are very important. Another thing that we found, as we've looked at our data, is that as we look at the different outcomes, the most important single predictor, so we know it's not institution versus family, the most important single predictor of our outcomes is the caregiver's well-being. So when we looked at a predictor of the child's health, it was the caregiver's health. So then we thought, well, infectious diseases, of course, you know? So we took out infectious diseases. We took out, you know, coughing and diarrhea, and we still find that the biggest predictor of the child's health was the caregiver's health, more so than where the latrine was. We looked at where the water was coming in from, all of that. It was the caregiver's health. Excessive labor, child labor. When you look just at kids working, we find a very normal pattern that kids who are helping out and working around the house are healthier, and girls do more around the house, and boys are doing more outside of the house, and they tend to be doing better in school. But when you look at excessive labor, that's completely driven by the caregiver's well-being. So the interventions that we have where we say we're going to give a family money to send their kid to school is likely not going to be very successful because you haven't met the needs of the family. The family needs that kid to be going out and working. Now, if the family is able to take that money and help support them, then it might help the kid. But the interventions, you know, where we're just targeting that orphan, which we do so often, we want to take care of that kid. We want to give them a uniform. We want to give the kid some food. We want to give the kid the educational support, is not going to be as effective than working with the whole family. Staying in school, it also predicted the emotional well-being and difficulties that the child was experiencing. So the caregiver's well-being, again, was a predictor of the child's emotional well-being. So we want to say that it's the quality of the care that matters. And this care can happen in different places. And we need to be thinking about how we're supporting communities, how we're supporting families, what kind of lessons and what kind of supports is it that matters? Is it food? Is it education? Is it different things? And we need to try and figure that out. And one of the things I'm very committed to doing now that we have not done as much in the past is trying to figure out locally derived measures of positive outcomes. So from an international perspective, we say getting through the 12th grade is a good outcome. Waiting a few years before you get married after you graduated is a positive outcome. Maybe not having as many kids, that's a positive outcome. But those are our measures. And I don't know, in fact, I'm pretty sure that in many communities around the world, that's not going to be what they see as the best outcome for their kid. If you graduate from high school and there is no chance that you're going to be leaving that village or getting a different kind of job, then why stay in a school that's teaching the kinds of things that we teach if it's not going to benefit you? That actually could be more hurtful to the family and to the other kids who are there. So what we're going to be doing is going back and talking with the children, talking with providers, talking with caregivers, families, and asking, what do you see as a good outcome for a kid? When someone is 20, what's a good outcome? What do you think? And it may be that being in an arranged marriage at age 16 rather than 14 is a positive outcome for some kids. So we need to understand that as we move forward. So again, the work that I do is really, I'm in public policy. The research that we do is always to focus on a problem that is current, and we're looking for solutions that are able to be implemented and sustainable without a lot of intervention from the outside that's long-term. So we've got our observational studies that we do. We test different interventions to see if they work, and we want those interventions to be things that have the potential to keep going after others are gone. And we want to try and make our research available to policymakers. And a policymaker could be the head of a family. It could be the head of a group home. Or it can be the policymakers who are in kind of the global sphere, who are making decisions through the Institute of Medicine and evaluations, through PEPFAR. We've got a US action plan on children and adversity. And we're trying to get our research findings to people who will actively use them. And it's really important to be working with local policymakers, local leaders, as we work in different countries around the world. It's so tempting. In fact, working in Russia, one of my colleague there, my closest colleague there said, you know, you guys have made a big mistake because you've come here and done thousands of studies. I don't know if that's true, but thousands of studies around HIV/AIDS, but you've published it all in English. We don't have access to the results, and our government is saying, we won't believe these findings if it's in English. Why is it not in our Russian journals? Why do you not come and talk to us? You go and give talks at Yale, you go to conferences around the world, but you're not talking to us. And it's true, we've done that around the world. So we really make an effort to try and have our findings and work with our sites to write up articles for the newspaper, the local newspaper, to identify who the local leaders are, who could make a difference, to ask them what analyses, they're out there in the field every day talking, in this case, to the kids and the caregivers. What do they want us to look at in the data? What's of interest to them? So as we're trying to work to make things better, the situation that we've fallen into is that we also want to try and not allow things to get worse. So in the case of saying, we want all kids to be in a loving family, those loving families aren't there now. We don't want to close down options, in this case, group homes, before we have the loving families available to put kids into. And it's likely, as we look again at the increasing numbers of street kids around the world, it's likely that we're going to have needs for different kinds of options, for a menu of options, for a long time. And so we need to know what's possible within communities. We need to look at the community's strengths, what options, how many families there are who are available to take care of kids, how many are willing to take care of a number of kids, and what kind of other options are there too. And what I find in much of my work, including this work, with the HIV work and substance abuse work, is that in most cases, one size doesn't fit all in terms of policy options. So we need to keep working and looking for kind of menus and have formulas for going through and identifying what a community can do and can't do and how we're going to work with it and what these policy options are going to be. Thank you.
You can stay here. Great job, Kate.
Thank you.
We're happy to welcome any questions from the audience. You'll have to move to the microphones if you have questions, recall.
Okay, so my first question is your research and everything that you've put together.
Yes.
Overseas at impoverished communities. How are you going to make a difference here in the United States after you have come back here with these statistics? How are you going to convert the information that you have to help out the communities here in the U.S. for the kids that need the help here?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. So one of the things that we are working on right now is putting together a proposal that would follow a similar group of kids here in the United States, kids who are in foster care, who are living in residential education centers, and looking at the outcomes for these kids. So not including the treatment centers for kids, but the residential education programs that are here in the United States. And people who are working in those centers would say that they are very viable options also. And I also think that there are things, I know we have some foster care experts here, and I am not a foster care expert, but there are things that we can learn from the training that goes into the care providers who are in the residential education programs, the training and support that they receive that could actually potentially be transferred into foster care training for parents and things like that. I don't know. But those are some of the options. And I will also say that, I said that we had dropped Brazil. In our first grant proposal that went to the NIH, National Institutes of Health, we actually had a US sample that we were going to follow. And we had places set up in Durham, North Carolina, in Texas, in Chicago, New York City. And the reviewers said, kind of, that's crazy talk. I know, we have our system here in the US, you can't compare across countries. But one of the things that's happened, and the reason that we're now looking at this other proposal, is because when the press came out about this study, I received emails from people around the US saying, we need to be looking at this here. This is really important. And I will say that the policy train is on the same track here in the US, which is, we need to get rid of these longer-term residential programs. So those are just some of the things that we're working on. I'll also say that we're really committed to the local global. And some of the things that were learned in Russia, for example, in working with substance abusing moms, was that when we worked with their kids, that we were able to retain them in care and get them off drugs more quickly. And so we then worked with a judge in Durham to see if he would allow us, if a child was being abused, there's suspected abuse, if we could, I say we really don't think that this will continue if we can work with the family unit together. And we had a judge who said, yes, you can give this a try. So.
Wonderful talk, and I think we so respect your efforts. One slide at the very end, which caught my attention about street children, whose responsibility. You alluded earlier to how in your global experience, it's so culturally different in terms of whether it's a governmental approach or a neighborhood or parochial or whatnot. What's your perception about here in the United States? What is the psychology of that responsibility?
What is the psychology of the responsibility? Is that the question?
Yeah, in other words, as citizens, where do we stand when, with the issue of homelessness with children?
Yeah, so I was not as aware of the homelessness problem for kids here in the US until after I started doing this study. And actually there was someone who came and started working with me, who's doing a documentary on children on the run in the United States. And it is incredible, the number of kids who are on the streets, and also just a very, as far as I can see, a very invisible problem. And a lot of them are running also from the foster care system and get lost within that. But you have a lot of children out there, a lot of families out there who just aren't receiving the support that they need. And it doesn't get a lot of attention.
Referring back to the incidence of trauma slide.
Yes.
I may have misunderstood the numbers, but it looked like the incidence of trauma in family situations were several points higher than the institutional. Could you explain that?
So this goes very contrary to what most people would say. Well, most people who are in the policy world right now talking about institutional care. But it seems that when abuse is happening in an institution, we're able to take care of it. So it happens and it's very bad, and it can happen to a lot of kids all at once. But you can also monitor it, and kids will tell each other and they'll tell someone else. And in fact, we have had a case where we needed to deal with an institution where there was abuse happening. So in a sense, that can be a protective factor. Whereas the kids are in, again, the poorest of the poorest homes, and they're exposed to adults who are kind of on the streets, related and not. And so they are as vulnerable as the kids in institutions. I will also say that there's no significant difference when you look at it the regression analyses, there's no significant difference in any of the reported rates of trauma. So that's what's important. And in no way, I don't want anyone to go home. So I receive emails also saying, oh, Whetten, you just want to put all the kids in institutions. That is not true. I want to support families. I want to keep kids from going into institutions. I want to protect boys and girls. And we need to have a menu of options. But it's not that I think that care in one place or the other is better. It's the caregiving that happens in either place.
As a clinician, I'm wondering what are some of the types of roles that clinicians are taking in the work that you're describing, both in the US and internationally?
Yes, well, that will lead right into the next talk. So I'll save that for you. It's hard, and there are very few mental health, you're talking about mental health clinician? Yes, there are very few internationally, and so working on programs that we'll be talking about in a little bit, that allows more people to be involved and more people to be able to provide services without the kind of training that we would expect here in the US is really important.
Last couple questions?
Mr. Hughes sent me up here to ask 2 questions, and I'll let you answer them in the way you know best. The first one is, how will the research that you're speaking about stop the cycle of children ending up as street children? And also, does a society whose sociocentric versus egocentric cultures, is there a difference in the incidence of child homelessness in cultures versus the sociocentric culture versus the egocentric culture, that is?
So I would like to say for the second question that those communities that are more sociocentric take care of the children more. But I can't say that at the moment. In part, I think communities are changing so quickly economically. And you have places like in China, where I lived long ago, where there just was not homelessness at all. And now you're starting to see homelessness. And I will say also that, the raising children within the community and some of the stereotypes that we have of Africa also don't always hold up on any side, whatever those stereotypes are, whether it's that everyone is taking care of each other, whether it's that people are incredibly violent. We have these differing stereotypes. But I think a lot of this really follows economic pressures on communities. And as those economic pressures grow, which they have been, and I will say, as I've been traveling in the last 10 years with this study, and over the last year, I've asked everyone I meet pretty much, do you think things have gotten better or worse for poor people in your country over the last 10 years? Uniformly and without hesitation, people say it's worse. It is harder now for poor families, even though you look at the gross domestic product and you look at average income, it appears there are more motorcycles on the ground and but for a poor person, it is harder and harder for them to just live. So that's very different. And the first question, I'm sorry, I didn't just. How will the research that you speak of affect the cycle of children ending up as street children? Yeah, so what we're hoping is that as we are able to identify what resources within communities can be helpful and how to set up a menu of options for kids, including and how to support families, that hopefully we'll have fewer kids going onto the streets.
The last question over here.
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. I guess I'm thinking about what your thoughts are when you look at the data and you see that there's not a great big difference. There is no significant difference between your children living in institutions and children living in poor households. Yep. And the need for mental health care, probably not just for children, probably not just for the very poor, but it signals to me that there's an unmet need for screening, for services, and yes. Even though it's out of scope of this particular study, what are your thoughts about moving forward and sort of pulling out orphans from the general population or the poor, and then kind of linking that to the equity issue, right? So it's, pulling out the orphans, and yet there just seems to be a general need.
Yes, so I think an important thing about this is that there's great need. So again, going back to the non-orphan sample, who are also very vulnerable in very poor communities, that it is the poorest communities and families who are taking care of the kids. And so we need to have interventions that are focusing on communities, they're focusing on families, not just targeting the children. And this is, again, not saying that institutions, that group homes are good places for kids. It's about the care, being able to provide quality care wherever that is. And you can do it in ways that are not very expensive, and where you have stable caregiving over time. You're not moving the kid from one family member to another, every 6 months as someone is able to take care of the kid. And so we need to be thinking more holistically about how we're working with children, families, and communities. And hopefully things will get better.
Okay, very last question.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm a lay person, but but I am an engineer, and so I crank out a lot of PowerPoints. And it would have been more helpful to me with a little more information what the metrics were. What were the? I take your word for it when you show a curve, and then those early curves where it seemed to be that it was like the y-axis, and you had kind of a bell shape, and then you fused them together.
Yep.
Anyway, so there was, so it would have been, this is just kind of a comment. I would have been.
I come from a family of engineers.
Well, one of the things that, one of the things that we were trained to do was to, most of the time, say what the X and Y axis was, so that would have been.
I encourage you, we have a number of papers. We've got about a dozen papers that have come out that have all of that in there.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I don't like to get too bogged down, particularly in a talk like this, with the actual indices, is that each index that we look at has whether it's positive or negative, and whether that's a good outcome or a bad outcome, and whether it's from 0 to 40 or 1 to 5, it differs for all of them. So it takes a long time to kind of work through that. And really what I wanted you to get is this visual aspect of seeing the data there. But look up the manuscripts.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
We've got a bunch.
Yeah, because of a downturn
We got it all explained, and the equations and everything, you'll love it.
Well, I have a degree in public administration, so I have a little bit of this, but I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's have one more round of applause for Professor Whetten. Good job. Good job.